There are no words to describe my anger and disgust at last night's episode of Game of Thrones. This third episode of the final season began and ended the war that had been promised since the very first episode, when we saw a White Walker kill a man for the first time. This was the supposed Götterdämmerung of the Game of Thrones mythology, the existential threat that required mankind to drop their petty squabbles and band together to make a final stand that was literally life against death. This was the Great Dread, a shadow that hung over the whole show since it first began. It all came down to this episode, the third in a final season of 6. And by the time it was over, I was trembling in rage at what is surely one of the most epic failures in pop culture history, on a par with the saccharine Hallmark card ending of Lost or the jumping of the blue shark that completely destroyed Breaking Bad for me. This one hurts, people. I can't lie. This one hurts badly. Those of you out there who loved this episode, I have no ill feelings toward you, and I hope that you reciprocate this lack of malice as you listen to my opinion, realizing that an attack on this show is in no way an attack on you. Clearly, this is not a failure on the order of Star Trek Discovery, not a brain-dead chunk of idiocy so utterly horrible that one cannot help but look down at anyone who loves it. This episode could certainly be looked at in a number of ways, and certainly people of intelligence and good taste could look at this episode and reasonably be very satisfied with it. But the reverse is also true, and it is for this half of the split fandom that I speak now. In this video, I'm going to attempt to explain exactly why I hated this episode with the white-hot rage of a billion exploding galaxies chock full of TNT. It has little to do with subverted expectations, although there is some of that, and it isn't really how the characters were portrayed so much, or the SJW plague that like an army of zombies has swarmed over this show, dragging it from its former soaring heights to the filthy mudflats below, although there's some of that too. But more than all that, the reason why this episode made me stop loving Game of Thrones has to do with the shabby, slapdash way this episode was executed, and the fact that after watching every episode below these many years, the promised apocalyptic conclusion was a bungled mess of inconceivable proportions. Anyone who calls me a hater of Game of Thrones is a moron, period. I have loved this show passionately for years. Anyone who knows me, who has listened to my live streams or followed my work, knows that I have been an outspoken advocate for this show and have forgiven it even when good folks like Nerdrotics were harder on it than I. I believed in Benioff and Weiss. I was convinced that they knew what they were doing, even after the first 2 filler episodes that started this season. I love character moments, and for the most part, even while lamenting that the plot had been suspended as these characters meandered at leisure from dramatic scene to dramatic scene in the first 2 episodes, I was tolerant. And when I saw this episode was feature film length, I was beside myself with joy. When I saw Melisandre ignite the swords of the Dothraki hordes into flame using the power of the Lord of Light, I actually cheered out loud and applauded. But it was all downhill from there, with escalating levels of disappointment turning into actual horror. Despite all my good wishes, despite all my love, or perhaps because of my love for this show, this episode turned me, as surely as the Night King turns a fallen hero, into a monstrosity. And so now I must speak out, because come what may, Doomcock is no shill, and I will never allow myself to be hypnotized, to be conned by my own disappointment into putting on a happy face, into saying, "Oh, it wasn't that bad," just because I wish it weren't so. Last night's episode was a straight-up disaster that has killed this show for me. Deader than a burning zombie with a dragon glass dagger sticking out of its eye and a Valerian sword shoved where the sun don't shine. My major problem with this episode was the contemptibly shoddy and abominably incompetent way it was filmed, directed, and edited. For all I know, there might have been a great show somewhere in that hour and a half last night. Too bad there was no way to see it. The clown who directed it, and the cretin that edited it, and the visually impaired buffoon who lighted it should be sued for cinematic malpractice. People, There is little I hate in cinema more than a lazy director and an ADHD editor. Last night, despite the mortal threat to all of these characters I've come to love for lo these many years, I felt absolutely nothing for any of them because I couldn't see a goddamn thing. The director failed in spectacular fashion to set these scenes in any coherent fashion. I never had any idea where anyone was, and every single battle scene was shot in the dark, in close-up, with a shaky camera, with a new shaky dark close-up shot cut to every 1 to 2 seconds, so that I was never emotionally involved in anything that was happening. This was directing at its lowest level. It was incompetent, and it was infuriating. While I could intellectually process, hey, that was a shot of Sir Jorah, I guess he's in danger. Oh, and that blurry lump over there, wasn't that Sam Tarly? He looked kind of scared in that 2-second shot, but it was hard to tell in the dark. And gee, this dark part of the castle looks exactly like that dark part of the castle. And the battle in the courtyard might as well be inside the castle, since all I can see in the frame in either location is a frame packed with zombies and swinging swords. And oh gee, there's a dragon battle in the dark. Can't really tell which is the good dragon and which is the undead one. But boy, I guess I should be excited because there's clearly some biting going on. I generally kind of knew when someone was wounded or died, but for the life of me, I couldn't tell in the dragon battle when it ended, whether the undead dragon had been defeated, and when an undead dragon appeared at the end, I wasn't sure if it was the original undead dragon, or whether John's dragon, swarmed by biting, stabbing zombies, had died and been resurrected. Yeah, it was that kind of show. And when the dragon stuff threatened to become too clearly visible, the Night King unleashed a blast of snow, clouding the sky. The Mutara Nebula came to Westeros, and once again, I couldn't see a damn thing. This was Quantum of Thrones. This was Jason Thrones. This was any one of a number of modern factory-farmed pieces of shit that are not so much crafted as synthesized, soullessly covered with handheld cameras that fake excitement by shaking a lot. Patchwork sequences assembled from a whole bunch of random uninspired footage by a hack director covering his ass, making sure he has tons of coverage of the action, then turning it over to a hack editor who takes these random shots and throws them into his flatbed Cuisinart and blends them together with all the art of an automobile assembly line. My hatred of this episode, my fury with every filmmaker on this team, is largely due to the absolutely defective way it was filmed and edited. After 7 seasons and years of waiting to take such a pivotal battle and present it with woefully inadequate lighting, handheld shaky cam, choppy ADHD editing is a fucking crime, and a crime I will never forgive. This show is dead to me now. Does that seem harsh to you? Consider this. The fate of almost everyone on this show that I care about was at stake. This episode should have been cathartic in ways both sublime and gross. I should have felt every single moment of menace. Every character should have been not only clearly visible, but clearly set in a location established periodically with long shots that lingered long enough to register the spatial relationships, the forces arrayed against each other, and a clear definition of what the stakes were at that moment. Instead of cutting from one dark, jumbled scene of mayhem into another dark, jumbled scene of mayhem in another part of Winterfell, they should have had some high angles above the castle, showing the action from a wide point of view to give us a sense of scale. And when we move to another part of the castle, why not do it from a high angle, soar above the mayhem to the other location in a manner evocative of the classic map opening? Track in on a battle so we have some idea of where everything is and what is at stake at that moment. Cutting every 1 to 2 seconds from chaotic close-up to chaotic close-up in the dark completely renders the fate of these characters academic. You can't fully become invested even in the fate of characters you love because you can't see them. Certainly, there were times where I knew where I was, but for a lot of the time I was simply numb, lost, and disgusted. I wanted to get emotionally involved in this show, but in every single instance I was thwarted, either by my inability to see what was going on and register it with any kind of coherence, or I was thwarted by what was actually happening, which underwhelmed and disappointed me at virtually every turn. Aside from the deplorable technical incompetence of this episode, an unforgivable sin given the time and money and resources it took to make it happen, I was deeply disappointed that this episode seemed utterly disconnected from all that came before it. In other words, nothing that seemed so very important during this entire series seemed to matter in the slightest when it came time to deal with the Night King. Let's start with the much-fabled Dothraki. Other than her dragons, the Khaleesi's great strength had always been her Dothraki hordes, her army of savage, bloodthirsty barbarian warriors from across the Narrow Sea. Much were they dreaded, and little did they ultimately matter, as the show dispatches the entirety of the Dothraki horde in the first few minutes of the episode in what essentially amounted to a visual joke of sorts. Dark humor, no doubt, but humor all the same. In the coolest moment of the entire episode, Melisandre uses the power of the Lord of Light to ignite all the Dothraki swords. It was a spectacular sight. Why? Because they showed it in close-up, they showed it in medium shots, and they had a breathtaking shot of the swords bursting into flame in a wave that swept through the whole ranks, seen from above in good lighting on a camera mounted on a tripod. It was breathtaking and elegant, and at this point I was sold, convinced that what I was about to see would be as great as the Battle of the Bastards or the Khaleesi's first assault in Westeros on that wagon train. But no. In an idiotic blunder of botched strategy, the writers then send the Dothraki off into the pitch blackness of night, riding with their flaming swords into who the hell knows what. What kind of idiot general does that? Sends a major portion of his forces into a battle where he doesn't know the deployment of the forces, has no idea how many of the enemy there are, how entrenched they are, or even exactly where they are. All for an effective but ultimately empty shot of all the flaming swords, like little embers in the distance, being snuffed out and darkness reigning again. It is, admittedly, a chilling and beautiful moment, until you consider the tactical stupidity of it, and realize that all the Khaleesi did to raise this army, transport it, and lead it to help her seize the Iron Throne was just for this moment. So much for the Dothraki. Just like that, gone. After all that narrative time spent developing them, they fizzled like a damp narrative firecracker. And they were not alone, as expectation after expectation was subverted and monumental developments from the past were minimized and breezily dismissed as insignificant. All the boring hell we had to endure with Bran and his nonsensical trip down memory lane to Three-Eyed Raven Town, what did all that narrative amount to? In the pitch of battle, Bran tells Theon, "I'm going now," and placidly takes over some ravens, warging himself into them. And why does he do that? I don't know. Maybe he wanted a better view of what was going on because the cameras at Winterfell were too shaky and the lighting was terrible. So he decided to watch the action using Raven Cam TM. But in terms of the significance of the battle, in terms of contributing in any way to it, in terms of making us see any reason whatsoever for this boring Three-Eyed Raven bullshit to have any meaning at all, Bran was worthless filler. Just like he's always been. Poor Hodor. What a waste of time Bran was all along. Just like the Dothraki, who died far off camera in the dark. And what of the dreaded undead dragon? That portent of doom that we've all feared since the end of Season 7? No big deal. It breathes a little fire, doesn't seem to hurt much. It blows blue fire on the other dragons, but they seem immune. So the whole arc of the dreaded undead dragon comes down to a jumbled scene in the dark where two dragons are biting each other in the air. And you know, maybe that would have been exciting if you could really see which dragon was which without squinting into the darkness. And it didn't help that everything was in motion and they kept cutting around the fight in quick succession. And how did it end? The Night King falls off his mount, but lo and behold, he's just fine. So a fall from a great height doesn't break the Night King into pieces, doesn't break his back or crush his skull, because he's apparently invulnerable to physical damage of any kind. He's immune to fire, it seems, as well, when Daenerys blasts him at point-blank range. A clue he was once Targaryen, I suppose, since he rode the undead dragon. And the Ice Dragon apparently shows up again at the end, leaking blue flame from the wound in his neck, though why he dropped off and disappeared after the battle, who knows? I thought he was dead, but I guess he was just pining for the fjords. He was merely undead, after all. Which leads us to the colossal disappointment of Jon Snow. We were promised, it was foretold, it was foreshadowed, that Jon was brought back from the dead to deal with the Night King. He was a Targaryen, he had Valyrian steel, and the look between him and the Night King in Hardhome was an epic moment that promised of glories to come. And what did it amount to? After Daenerys tries to fry the Night King, Jon has his chance. The Night King is alone, and Jon closes on him, sword at the ready. The Night King perceives him, turns, and just raises a bunch of dead around Jon. And as Jon has to deal with the swarm of undead, like the rest of the episode, the Night King just strolls away. How does Jon survive, being engulfed by the undead with only a long sword to help him in close proximity? No idea. He just turns up later okay. And what does Jon come down to in the end? What is his fate? What is his ultimate purpose in this episode? He yells at the undead dragon rampaging in the castle. Yeah, the entire story of Jon Snow comes down to him not attacking the dragon, not giving his life to kill it, not slaying it, not trying to slay it, but just kind of getting pinned down, then standing up as it prepares to blast him, and then yelling at it before it crumbles to dust. Yep, that's right. Someone gets the Night King. But it isn't Jon or Daenerys. Nope, it's Arya. In one of the worst bits of outrageous bullshit I've ever seen, Arya kills the Night King. How, you ask? Well, so most of the show, Arya's running terrified through Winterfell, fleeing the undead who are swarming and in close pursuit. So she gets locked into a room with Melisandre, and there are zombies at the door, and Melisandre looks at her and says, "What do you have to say to the Night King?" And Arya pauses, then says resolutely, "Not today," and calmly slips away. Though where she calmly slips away to in a castle overrun with undead, I have no idea. She vanishes until the end. So she was fleeing and relentlessly pursued, terrified and alone, until the Red Witch says this to her, and suddenly she decides, hey, I ought to go kill the Night King. Brilliant, Arya. Wow, why didn't anyone think of this before? What an amazing plan. And so the end comes, and the Night King has been lured into the courtyard with the magic tree to kill Bran, though why the Night King is so obsessed with killing someone as ineffectual as Bran, I have no idea whatsoever, since all he did in the battle was go warg into some crows to watch the fun from afar. And Theon dies in vain trying to kill the Night King, and as the Night King is about to kill Bran, Arya runs up behind him and attacks. He grabs her by the neck and by her knife hand, but she drops the knife into her free hand and stabs him in the leg, and game over, man, game over. He shatters, and that's the end of this entire series, which shatters into broken shards of disappointment as surely as this formerly formidable entity does. What do I find so unspeakably offensive about this ending? First of all, Arya is fleeing the swarming undead until she gets the Red Witch pep talk, but just by saying, okay, I'm gonna go kill him, Arya manages to elude all the swarming undead, manages to get the drop on the Night King, just runs up behind him as he's standing in front of Bran, running past all his lieutenants who don't do diddly squat. She wasn't detected, like all of a sudden being unable to elude the undead and getting cornered by them. The Red Witch pep talk gives her what, plus 20 stealth? We'll never know, as we don't see Arya make her way to the Night King. It's supposed to be a surprise. And the most offensive thing about this, Arya doesn't use her one superpower to get the Night King. I could forgive this a lot more if she took the face of the dead for her own and used it as a disguise to sneak up on the Night King. That at least would have justified all the pointless time we spent training with the Faceless Men. It would have demonstrated guile and skill, and would explain how Arya could manage to sneak through a literal army of undead. But now, well, she just appears behind the Night King and stabs him in the leg. Swell. Maybe she saw Cobra Kai and was inspired by Stingray. But I only speculate on that point. I'm sorry to say this, but this episode basically renders everything that came before it into a joke. All the sacrifices were for nothing. Daenerys sacrificed a dragon, all to get one of the undead, to show Cersei, to convince Cersei to join forces with them to defeat the dreaded Night King, saying over and over again that if they don't all fight together, they'll die. That was a complete waste, since Cersei lies and never sends her troops, but it doesn't matter because it was a lie that they'll all need to band together to defeat the Night King. All they needed was Arya to sneak up on him. So the quest to get the undead guy was pointless. The sacrifice of the dragon was pointless. The turning of the dead dragon by the Night King was pointless, as that undead dragon did fuck all in the battle. The Dothraki were worthless despite their long arc. The promised significance of Jon Snow was never delivered on. Daenerys was a largely insignificant factor because the Night King is fireproof, and so getting the drop on him with a dragon was pointless. Arya's training as a faceless man was used for nothing but to settle things with Walder Frey time and time again. This dimly lighted assemblage of visual gibberish failed to connect the past with the present. Maybe that's why they didn't light it and edited it in the choppy way they did. It's harder to be sure you're disappointed in something when you aren't even sure what that something was or what was happening or where. As I've said, for these reasons, Game of Thrones is dead to me. I know many were angered by the wokeness of how this show has shaped up. The Force was female in this episode, and indeed is in this series. As the diminutive Lady Mormont slays the undead giant, Jaime Lannister serves under Brienne of Tarth, Arya is the one who kills the Night King, and the men are largely ineffectual, as even the Hound is saved by Arya, Tyrion is lectured to by Sansa, and Jon Snow yells impotently at a female undead dragon. I guess there was no way that in this woke day and age they were going to let a white male like Jon White-Ass Snow be the hero, but that doesn't make the disappointment with this narrative any more palatable. And so there you have it. I no longer care about this show. They blew it for me. And if you feel differently, I'm very, very happy for you. I truly am. But I will not be rewatching this show ever again. And I can't believe it's come to this. And thus, my Game of Thrones watch is ended. For the show was dark and full of shaky cam. From the center of the earth, this is Dictor Van Doomcock bidding you all, my friends, stay angry.